I am now delighted to introduce the Peggy Glanville-Hicks Address, which is a critical annual event in the Australian art music calendar. The Peggy Glanville-Hicks Address offers a platform for outstanding advocates of Australian music to challenge the status quo and raise contemporary issues and debates in art music. In this, our 50th year of operations, we are honoured and privileged to welcome a world-renowned performer who truly challenges the status quo as our keynote speaker. Harpist, artistic director, leader, curator, educator, industry advocate, collaborator, and commissioner. These titles cannot begin to convey the vast contribution that Marshall McGuire has made to the Australian art music community throughout his career. From shearing sheds to grand concert halls, Marshall has delighted and inspired audiences across the globe with his innovative and adventurous approach to the harp. It would take me all night to list Marshall's achievements. However, I will say Marshall is a prolific recording artist. He has commissioned countless composers and, of course, is the chair of our board and has been an incredible mentor to myself and many others in the community. It's my greatest pleasure to now introduce you to Marshall McGuire for the 2025 Peggy Glanville-Hicks Address.
Thank you, Kath. Thank you, everybody. I too would like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and note the storytelling and music making and singing and dancing that's gone on these lands for thousands of generations. It's a bit nerve-wracking being in a room full of friends and colleagues so dear and stretching back so far in a career. The talk tonight, it's a reflection. Some of you will know that I've just recently finished 10 years in a job as Director of Programming at Melbourne Recital Centre and embarking on a new stage. Some people call it retirement. I'm not quite ready to do that yet. There's still a lot to do. But it did get me thinking about where I've come from, the people I've met, and the steps that have helped me get through a career. In 1990, I was washing a friend's car and talking to a neighbour who was washing his car. It was in Australia Street in Camperdown, and he asked what I did, and I said, I play the harp. And he said, I've just made a film about a woman who wrote a piece for harp. I said, oh yeah, what's her name? He said, Peggy Glanville-Hicks. And I said, I've never heard of her, but that sounds interesting. Absolute true story. And that was the beginning of my knowledge of and my love affair with Peggy Glanville-Hicks. I ended up playing for the launch of James Wilson's film, The PGH, A Modern Odyssey, at the Australia Council, which is still then in Redfern. That's how far back we go. And, of course, Peggy's Sonata for Harp has become a centrepiece of my recording and performing career ever since. So Peggy's been with me for a long time, accompanying me in my journey. I never got to meet Peggy, unfortunately. I think we'd have got on very well. We've all heard the stories that James Murdoch and particularly Ross Edwards would tell of going to Peggy's for 11s, and she'd pour you a brandy and soda, heavy on the brandy, light on the soda, dear, and peel you a prawn as a snack. I think we'd have got on very well. But I did have the privilege of spending 9 months in the Peggy Glanville-Hicks house as a fellow there, to soak up her spirit as a generous, imaginative, creative and bold composer and a bold advocate for Australian musicians in the world. In 1999, as president of the New Music Network, I was pleased to inaugurate this lecture series, if you like. It coincided with the opening of the studio at the Sydney Opera House, which was a big moment for new music in Sydney. And the first address that year was given by James Murdoch. I'd note too the years I spent on the Peggy Glanville-Hicks Composers House Trust, which still continues to support composers to this day. And that trust is of paramount importance to the creative life of this country, continuing to support composers in very real, practical ways. I mentioned I wanted to broadly break this into 3 parts, sort of past, present, future. We'll have a little bit of a musical break, so you can take a deep breath between all my words. But looking at the ties that bind us all and reflecting on the enormous legacy and the influence that our forebears have gifted to us. My music education has been very broad since the very beginning as a chorister at St Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne. Brought up on a diet of Orlando Gibbons and Thomas Wilkes, of William Byrd and Benjamin Britten, and along with newer works, of course, including music by the music director at the time, June Nixon, who, as well as being a phenomenal organist, is an eminent composer in her own right. My studies at school involved a lot of music theatre for some reason and a lot of orchestral music. And then embarking on my time at the VCA, the Victorian College of the Arts, from 1981, I was exposed to an extraordinary range of music, from 14th century plain chant with John Stinson through the music of the present day with guest lecturers, including, memorably, Michael Finnessy, opera and song with Dame Joan Hammond and Gerald English, Gerald who became a very close collaborator later on, jazz and improvisation with the holy trinity of jazz performers Brian Brown, Bob Settergreen and Tony Gould, a very close bond with Hugh Jones, my teacher, my harp teacher, and orchestral music, of course, with the great John Hopkins. It was quite a lineup for practicing artists teaching at that institution. And it was this breadth of music exposure that developed, I think, it must have been an open mind and a willingness to explore a collaborative streak. And I guess I'd have to say an insatiable appetite for the new and the possibilities of what could be. After studies in Paris with Marie-Claire Jamet, at the time she was the harpist with Pierre Boulez's Ensemble Intercontemporain, I moved to Sydney in 1988 and joined the Orchestra of Opera Australia. What was an extraordinary time in that company on reflection. At the time it felt exciting. At the same time as we premiered Baz Luhrmann's new La Boheme, which really changed the conversation about opera, we were farewelling Dame Joan Sutherland. We had new productions of the Meistersingers of Nuremberg, which is the gift from Germany in our bicentennial year. We did Janacek operas with Charlie Mackerras. And I remember, I'll never forget my first rehearsal in this new role was the Sitzprobe of The Merry Widow with Joan Sutherland and Richard Bonning. Yeah, I thought I'd made it. That was pretty good. Of course, we also perform operas by Australian composers, Richard Mille in particular. Voss had just been premiered, and Mare de Glace, some may remember his follow-up opera, was premiered during the time I was there. There was so much vibrant creative work being done in all the areas of the company on those stages. And again, a real sense of collaboration and partnership. At around that same time, that same year, 1988, two other very important things happened. I made my first appearance at the Adelaide Festival in performances of Helen Gifford's Regarding Faustus. It was a small one-man show with the irreplaceable Robert Gard, and also joining the Elysian Ensemble at the invitation of Darryl Buckley, and a position I'm still privileged to hold this day, nearly 40 years later. Can you believe it? The relationship with Darryl and the musicians of Elysian, the performers and composers and everyone who supports that activity, has been central to my creative life, to my artistic life, to my sense of who I am as a musician and as a person. Darryl, as an artistic director, has a very clear artistic vision, is a very bold leader, and always challenges us as performers to explore new areas, supported by and guided by the whole of the ensemble. It's a unique and rich experience, which I treasure. I always advise young musicians to try everything at least once, because you never know what doors will open. An example of this, during my studies at the Royal College of Music as a postgrad student, I was introduced to the Baroque harp, completely by accident. Someone said, would you like to take up the Italian triple-strung harp? I thought, yeah, sure, how hard can that be? And that opened up an incredibly rich strand of musical experiences which continued to enrich my life to this day and arguably changed the way I thought about improvisation and music. And of course, then a decade of freelancing with much regional touring, driving up and down the Pacific, the Hume, the New England highways to towns large and small, from Trangie to Ballina, from Wagga to Coonamble. I remember Ballina, there was a big sign across the main street welcoming Riley Lee and Marshall McGuire to Ballina, and that was the moment I knew I'd made it. But it also reminded me that audiences outside our cities are often more open-minded and embracing than their city counterparts. A concert in town becomes more than just about the repertoire or the performer. It has the capacity to draw communities together and to bring artist and audience together in a very intimate and engaging way. I've long advocated for a more proactive, decentralised approach to performance of music in Australia, and I looked at the establishment of some key arts groups like Dance North in Townsville, the Arena Theatre Company, now based in Bendigo, the Flying Fruit Flies, of course, in Albury, as well as the vibrant network of dozens of performing arts centres around the country, all actively engaged in nurturing local talent, as well as nurturing artists from around the country and from around the world to connect with their communities. Not to mention the smaller regional music festivals in all the states, and there are so many of them, focusing on classical and art music and somehow surviving in this very challenging post-pandemic festival environment. All completely authentic. I have to smile. The organ and choir work is by Parry. I Was Glad, and it's still there. Like 50 years later in my brain, I could sing it. Not quite the treble line. Just hearing the works. Just in case you don't know, the Peggy Glanville-Hicks Harp Sonata, Donatoni Marches, a very important work for me. Some music by Guillaume de Machaut. Schoenberg's Transfigured Night. In the 80s, I had 2 albums on rotation on my turntable. One was Transfigured Night, and the other was Dead Can Dance's new album, whatever it might be, and that was my soundtrack. And Monteverdi's Orfeo the Toccata. So some glimpses of my musical heritage, if you like. But now, moving on to now, I feel like, as I mentioned, I'm entering a new chapter of a career, and looking back, it's fair to say with a little bit of nostalgia, which inevitably comes as that part of the journey. The 90s seemed to be an incredibly vibrant time in Australia's cultural life. The orchestras, while still with the ABC, were committed to recording and commissioning and performing new works and existing works by Australian composers, and much of my early life as an orchestral musician was spent in the studios at Waverley Road in Melbourne with the MSO, just recording new works all the time. The Sydney Spring Festival, which many in this room will remember, remains a great shining light in my experience and the experience of many, curating epic programs of Australian and international performers and repertoire in startling new ways. As a sector, we're remarkably diverse, and I think sometimes it's hard to see the connections between our unique styles and voices. At the recent Surrounding Sound conference presented by the Australian Music Centre, we rallied around the call to embrace non-genre approach to our sector. And we'll all be aware that even in the last 30 years, we've gone through discussions about, is it new music, is it contemporary music, is it contemporary art music, is it contemporary classical music? Why don't why don't we just call it music? We can pull down the boundaries, we can celebrate that we all make music under the banner of music and collectively grow the sector and reach audiences outside the tent. I mentioned before my time at the VCA, which is a rich time of creative freedom. I think it's fair to say that in the early 80s, it was still finding its feet. We were pretty much free to do whatever we wanted to do. All the schools, notably, the dance school, the art school, the music school, were led by practicing artists, and collaboration and exploration was a key part of our activity. In the early 90s, of course, the Dawkins reforms to the tertiary sector came into being with these smaller technical colleges being attached to larger universities, and it was a bold move and seemed to offer security and opportunity for growth and development. Looking back now and reflecting on the state of some of our tertiary institutions, in fact all the tertiary sector, one wonders whether the match of small, focused technical colleges with megaliths is indeed fit for purpose. As far back as 10 years ago, John Dawkins himself reflected that perhaps the model was due for review. After 25 years then, much had changed, and he repeated it recently when it came up in conversation. And it's worth reflecting on, again, I think the nature of music training at tertiary level seems incompatible with some universities' teaching models, and I don't brush everybody with the same brush there. Some do very well, but some struggle within the structures of their university model and doesn't necessarily reflect the nature of training and skills required to create not just a financially viable future for artists, but fully rounded, inquisitive, thoughtful, creative artists. These colleges that do retain a level of autonomy and focus continue to produce such artists and surely provide some sort of evidence about the appropriate match of teaching and skills building. Some fresh eyes on this sector and the major performing arts companies which anchor and amplify so much Australian work is surely welcome. Eamon Flack recently, he's the artistic director of Belvoir Street Theatre, in a submission to the Taxation Summit held recently in Sydney, made the following observation which resonated with me. He said, but here's the thing, even after Revive, Creative Australia's new cultural policy, or the government's cultural policy, the basic structures put in place by the Nugent Report, the 1999 inquiry into the major performing arts, remain. The favoured list of institutional companies, which has barely shifted in 25 years, a shrinking second tier of small to medium companies, no serious practical recognition of the vital importance of freelance artists and independent companies, governance structures at odds with the particular nature of arts organisations, and funding levels that are based on a business and artistic environment which is 25 years old. He goes on, the system is no more sustainable financially or artistically than it was before the Nugent Report. The world has changed dramatically, but the performing arts in 2025 are still operating on Windows 99. That was a selection of works, including Lisa Lim's epic Garden of Earthly Desire, John Rogers' Birds for Genevieve, that he wrote for Genevieve and I some years ago, and new works by composers who have really captured my imagination and indicate a new way of moving forward. Brenda Gifford, Ryan Clapham and Nat Barch, who gave the PGH address last year as well. I was delighted to note recently an initiative by the Progressive Deutsches Symphony Orchestra in Berlin, the DSO, which was founded as the Rias Orchestra post-war in 1946 by the Americans at that time in Berlin. The orchestra decided that in the 2023-24 season, every single concert must feature at least one work by a female composer, and they publicly announced the measure for accountability. They noted that at the time, and we're all familiar with these statistics, but music written by female composers accounted for only 2% of the works performed by professional orchestras in Germany. Sadly, that figure is even lower than the global standard. For instance, a report by the organisation Donne, Women in Music, found that 7.5% of orchestral programming worldwide in that season consisted of works by women. And this number, along with other key diversity statistics, was a decline on the previous season. For the DSO, though, importantly, and this is my point, this measure had the support of the whole company. It wasn't just a programming initiative. It was supported by everybody, proudly championed by the marketing team as much as by its programming team. And this leadership, this confidence, this attention to representing music of our time and place, as well as making moves to rebalance the imbalance, is a bold sign that this sort of programming can be achieved. Often the internal needs of an organisation can overrule the artistic and societal aims of a programming team, to the detriment of artists and performers and audience and the industry and the broader society. Organisations, especially large organisations with significant financial support from government and private sources, surely have a responsibility to champion the work of new and established voices from our own place and time, as well as ensuring that the works and composers from our history have their place in the repertoire. I know that orchestras are under a lot of scrutiny every year when their seasons are announced and often come up short in the view of many. I'm always interested to see what's included in, the big announcement, here's our season, but I'm more keen to know the whole picture, as this is often where the good news stories are, the education programs, the commissioning programs, the artist development programs, the cross-art form and cross-cultural collaborations, the regional touring, the chamber music and community programs, all of these often taking up more time in the orchestra's calendar than the main stage events. A confidence to showcase these activities will serve to heighten awareness of this excellent activity, not just with their subscribers, many of whom as donors are very keenly interested in these areas of endeavour, but with the broader community, as well as capturing national and global interest. I encourage our large companies to proudly champion the works of Australian composers, old and new, to fully align with Revive's beautifully crafted subheading, a place for every story, a story for every place. This also gives an opportunity for the media, in all its glorious fragmentary messiness, to amplify and circulate these stories far and wide. I also want to point to the extensive catalogue of Australian and other new music performed on stages around our country throughout the year. It's fair to say, and I'm guessing, I haven't done any research into this, but I'm guessing that opera and ballet and dance audiences have probably heard more new music in the 20th century than orchestral and chamber music audiences. A newly commissioned score for a new ballet will receive multiple performances. It will often tour and then will often go into repertory. And the audiences get to listen to and experience these new works with barely a murmur of disgruntlement. Even Opera Australia recently has presented Australian works in the past couple of years: Brett Dean's Hamlet, Joe Twist's The Death of Dr. Duncan, and Jonathan Mills' Eucalyptus in partnership with Victorian Opera. In 2020, State Opera South Australia launched a digital library of Australian operas, capturing performances of recent works as a library and repository of memory, reminding us of the good work that has gone on and continues to go on in our state capitals. Here can be found works by, and I'm going to list some composers, by Graham Kerner, by Martin Wesley Smith, Richard Mills, Mary Finsterer, Ross Edwards, John Haddock, Dennis Vaughan, Luke Stiles, Elliot Geiger, Joe Twist, George Palmer, Jack Simons. Again, we can probably do better with gender diversity there, I think. We're about 92% male by my gathering. I encourage you to check out this digital library. It is up online. I don't know if any of you know about it, but again, it's another example of how communication is really important to keep these stories active in the forefront of our minds and to connect with them to add to this rich repository. It's a very important document, I think. Can a website be a document? Sure, it is now. Let's make a concerted effort to unlock the vault. Let's explore the digital shells of decades of works that may well be due their audience. We all know that history is often the best judge of what stays and what gets forgotten. But without repeat performances, the wheels turn slowly, or they don't turn at all. And I encourage all of us as performers to actively build a repertoire of Australian works into our programs, from our childhood encounters, and here I would want to call out the AMEB as well, who've done an incredible amount of work to incorporate Australian works in all their grade levels across the board. The childhood encounters to student works, to our recital and concerto programs, and to our orchestral and opera and ballet stages. This can sit comfortably with the generous important commission programs for new work, which is so important to keep revitalising, regenerating the catalogue, so we continue to grow and develop the sector. In terms of challenges of the future, AI is clearly with us and posing considerable challenges and opportunities, I'd argue, in equal measure. The AMC and our colleagues at APRA, AMCOS and other licensing and member organisations have been very vocal and passionate in their opposition to any idea that existing copyright and licensing laws should be overlooked for the greater good. Time doesn't permit a longer argument tonight around the myriad issues, but we should all be vigilant and look out for each other to keep the barbarians at bay. A couple of weeks ago, Jonathan Mills, in his Keith Murdoch oration, looked at the challenges faced by AI and the opportunities we've always had with AI, which he called artistic intelligence. And he eloquently stated, he said, artistic intelligence is not an ornament. It's not a luxury. It's how we mourn and how we celebrate. It's how we ask questions too deep for language and how we search for ways to answer them. Let us be clear, he said, this is not a nostalgic plea to reject progress. It's a clarion call to shape it wisely, humanely, creatively. To insist that in the unfolding future of intelligence, the human heart still matters. That what we feel is just as important as what we know. And that our capacity to create, to imagine, to care, that ultimately is the highest form of intelligence we have. I often look to our colleagues in science as near cousins in terms of our creativity, our ambition, our struggles, our visibility, and our public awareness. We're all in the R&D business together. Brilliant individuals, often working in academia, striving to find time to be creative, to push the boundaries, to test the status quo, to make a mark. The public rarely understands or is aware of the work that's being done, but when asked, I hope will generally support the idea that science and art being supported as an important strand in our society is a good thing. Although, of course, the discourse is somewhat more polarised than in previous generations. Often, of course, there's failure, but it's in the trying the discoveries get made, the synapses connect, the new ideas are born. In 2013, I had the privilege of performing with Genevieve Lacey at a gathering of Nobel laureates in Lindau, Germany. It's an annual gathering of this august group with hundreds of young scientists from around the world invited to mingle with these laureates and soak up the brilliance. In attendance were a number of Australian Nobel laureates, Brian Schmidt, who won the 2011 Nobel Prize, who assured me, because I was really freaking out about this, that the universe is not going to slow down and implode, but it's actually growing bigger and getting faster. So I heard it from the horse's mouth, so that's good. Elizabeth Blackburn, Australia's only female Nobel Prize winner. She won the 2009 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for her work on telomeres and chromosomes. And Peter Doherty, of course, the 1996 Nobel Prize winner for his work on how the body's immune cells protect against viruses. Not present were my favourite couple of Nobel Prize winners, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, who in 2005 were awarded the Nobel Prize for their discovery about how Heliobacter pylori affected ulcers, stomach ulcers. Barry's theory was, and he was frustrated by the guidelines surrounding all the research he could do, but his theory was that stomach ulcers weren't caused by stress, but rather by bacteria. And in order to prove this, he swallowed a vial of bacteria and waited to see what happened. Somewhat of a bold move, but as he related later on, it's not the sort of thing you should do as an eminent professor. He said that's why you have PhD students. But to my point, Peter Doherty's book, The Beginner's Guide to Winning the Nobel Prize, which was on sale at the conference and every copy was snapped up, he listed 17 key points to be borne in mind if you want to head in that direction. Here's a selection of his points of how to win a Nobel Prize. Try to solve major problems and make really big discoveries. Be realistic and play to your strengths. Learn to write clearly and concisely. Find and cultivate your true passion. Think outside the box. Talk about the problem. Be generous and culturally aware. Be persistent and tenacious, but be prepared to fail. Your time is precious. Avoid prestigious administrative roles. Take care of yourself and live a long time, and have fun and behave like a winner. So, in the spirit of optimism, I'm eternally optimistic about the future, of practical solutions to intractable problems, to pushing boundaries, and recognising that we all form part of a link of creative artists, musicians, performers, composers, and writers going back many years. Here are my top 10 tips, not how to win a Nobel Prize, because that's all gone out the window now. But my top 10 tips for how to grow, to cultivate, to sustain, to illuminate, to elevate the art music sector in the next quarter of the 21st century. Be generous and celebrate others' successes. Nurture relationships outside the capital cities. Be persistent and tenacious, but be prepared to fail. Think big and bold and broad. Think about what your story is and tell it to get other people excited. Encourage the media to look at the substance, not just the style. That means let's look at the issues and not just the personalities. Don't forget that writing for dance and theatre and film and opera will guarantee multiple performances of your work. Let's have a really hard think about tertiary education and how we can best provide the training for musicians of the future. Actively embrace second and third and fourth performances of works. Let's get some of these what were once new works off the shelves and in front of audiences. And boldly celebrate the inclusion of Australian music in all our programs. And yes, I'm looking at you, the major performing arts companies around the country, and ensure that your seasons look and sound like Australia. Thank you for listening.